In the 1800s, your body was a medical emergency that occurred every single month. You were not sick, you were not dying, but the specific doctor standing in your parlour, the man your husband had summoned, the man whose opinion determined whether you worked, rested, or was committed, had written in a published medical text that what was happening inside your uterus was, in his precise clinical language, a form of temporary insanity. His name was Dr. Edward Tilt. His 1851 book on the preservation of the health of women described menstruation as a monthly crisis of the nervous system, a specific constitutional event so destabilizing that women could not be trusted with sustained thought, physical labour, or legal decisions during it. He was not a fringe voice. He was one of the most cited gynecologists in Victorian England. You woke up on the first morning of your period with one specific problem nobody in your life would name out loud. You had no products, not because they hadn't been invented, because the specific system Victorian society had built to manage this was designed around one principle above all others, that no one should ever know it was happening. Before we continue, subscribe. The specific mechanics of that system, the belt, the rags, the washing routine that consumed hours of your week, we will get to shortly. But first, you need to understand something about the women who couldn't hide it, the factory women, the seamstresses, because what happened to them when their body refused to be invisible had a specific name and a specific legal framework behind it, and it will stop you cold. You managed. Every month, you managed. The question was what it cost you. The specific object at the centre of your monthly life was called a menstrual belt. It was a loop of fabric, cotton or flannel, worn around the waist beneath your petticoats, beneath your corset, beneath every layer Victorian modesty required you to wear in public. Attached to it front and back were tapes. Those tapes held a pad in place. The pad was not purchased. It was made. You cut it yourself from old linen, old flannel, old clothing that had served its original purpose. You folded it into a thick rectangle and you pinned it or tied it to the belt, and you wore it under everything, and you went about your day. Historian Patricia Branca, in her 1975 study Silent Sisterhood, documented that middle-class Victorian women maintained a specific set of rags kept entirely separate from household laundry, washed privately, dried privately, stored in a specific box or bag that no male member of the household was ever supposed to encounter. The specific shame around this washing routine was so embedded in domestic life that even Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management, which documented everything, contained no reference to it whatsoever. The silence was deliberate. The silence was the point. If you were wealthy, your situation was marginally less miserable. By the 1880s, purpose-made sanitary towels were available from chemists, wrapped in plain paper with no identifying label, purchased without speaking the words aloud. You simply placed your coin on the counter, and the chemist placed the package in your bag. If you were a lady's maid or a housekeeper, your employers used cloths were your responsibility to launder. That was part of your position. If you were a factory girl, a seamstress, a scullery maid earning £5 a year, the belt and the homemade pad were your entire system. You made do with what you had. You washed in secret. You dried in secret. And every month, for 5 days, you carried the specific terror that the system would fail you at the worst possible moment. For many women, it did. The specific medical belief that governed your body in Victorian England was this: menstruation was not a normal biological function. It was a wound. Dr. W.C. Taylor wrote in his 1882 medical guide, A Physician's Counsels to Woman, that the menstruating uterus was in a state of, in his specific words, pathological congestion. He prescribed complete bed rest for the duration. No walking, no reading, no mental exertion of any kind. The specific Victorian medical argument, published, cited, repeated across dozens of texts between 1850 and 1900, was that the uterus and the brain existed in a state of biological competition. Energy directed toward thought during menstruation was energy stolen from the reproductive organs. The result, these physicians warned, was permanent damage to your fertility. Dr. Henry Maudsley, one of the most influential psychiatrists in Victorian England, published in 1874 that educating girls during puberty was medically dangerous for exactly this reason. His paper, Sex in Mind and in Education, was not a pamphlet. It was published in the Fortnightly Review and read by the men who ran schools, hospitals and Parliament. The specific treatment prescribed for severe menstrual pain was laudanum, a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol. Your doctor dispensed it without measuring the dose precisely. You took it without knowing what it contained. Women who took it monthly for years developed specific dependencies that their physicians documented as a separate condition entirely. A condition of female weakness, a condition of the nerves, a condition that had nothing to do with the drug they had prescribed. Now, as painful as everything you have heard so far has been, we have not yet reached the specific consequence that ended careers, destroyed livelihoods, and left women with no legal recourse whatsoever. Everything up to this point has been the uncomfortable half. Trust me, you want to stay for what comes next. If you worked in a Victorian factory, a textile mill, a match factory, a laundry, a packaging house, your employment existed on a specific legal foundation, the complete discretion of your employer. There was no employment contract protecting you. There was no sick leave. There was no minimum notice period for female workers in most industries before the late 1890s. If your foreman decided your productivity had dropped, if he decided your behaviour was irregular, if he decided, and this specific word appeared in dismissal records, that you were unreliable, you were let go without a character reference. Without a character reference, you could not find work elsewhere. That was not an inconvenience. That was destitution. Women's historian Judith Wolkowitz documented in City of Dreadful Delight the specific pattern of female factory dismissals in the 1870s and 1880s, the monthly clustering of terminations that foremen never recorded as menstruation-related because they never needed to. They simply wrote unsatisfactory. The women who received those letters understood exactly what it meant. A seamstress named Hannah Culwick, whose diaries, preserved at Trinity College, Cambridge, remain one of the most detailed records of working-class female life in the Victorian era, wrote in 1873 of losing 3 days of piecework income every month. 3 days of income she could not recover. 3 days that meant the difference between rent paid and rent owed. She did not describe it as suffering. She described it as arithmetic, the specific arithmetic of being a woman with a body in a system that had decided her body was her problem. The specific product that was supposed to solve all of this arrived in 1896. Johnson & Johnson released Lister's towels, the first commercially marketed disposable sanitary pad in England and America. They were sold in plain packaging. They were priced beyond what most working women could afford, and they failed commercially within a decade because women were too ashamed to purchase them from male chemists by name. The solution existed. The shame was more powerful than the solution. What finally changed things was not medicine. It was not legislation. It was a war. During the First World War, Belgian nurses discovered that the cellulose bandaging material being used to dress wounds absorbed fluid 5 times better than cotton. Kimberly-Clark began manufacturing it as Cellucotton. By 1920, they had repackaged it as Kotex, the first mass-market disposable pad sold in a self-service display so that women could take a box from a shelf without speaking to anyone. The specific design of that retail display, the box placed in a location where coins could be left, and a product taken without human interaction, was not an accident. It was an engineering solution to a century of shame. Full workplace protections for menstruating women in British industry did not arrive in any meaningful form until the 20th century was well underway. The specific medical framework that had classified menstruation as a temporary illness, that had given employers, physicians and husbands the language to control women's bodies and livelihoods for 100 years, did not collapse overnight. It faded, slowly, contested at every step by the women it had always harmed most. Hannah Culwick died in 1909. She kept her diaries for 40 years. She recorded the arithmetic of her body and her labour, with the specific matter-of-factness of a woman who had never expected the system to change in her lifetime. She was right. The Victorian medical establishment did not believe it was oppressing women. It believed it was protecting them. It had the published research. It had the professional consensus. It had the specific language of science. And for the better part of a century that was enough. They called it care. The women who lived through it called it a Tuesday.